I love knives. I think we all here love knives. It's mostly why we're here. It got most of us into EDC, and it's probably what brings us back when we, you know, maybe get a little bored with it for a while. Cool knife comes across your feed and you're like, wow, I like that. And then it just sucks you right back in. But there are some things about knives that drive me absolutely crazy. The design choices. We'll talk about like QC problems and design flaws in another video. This is specific to choices that designers make when making a knife for one reason or another. Sometimes it's not always avoidable, sometimes it is. So with that said, here are 5 things about knives that drive me absolutely crazy, probably you too. And if you stick around to the end, I'll throw in one bonus one that'll probably grind your gears also. With that said, let's do the damn thing. Item number 1 on the list, thumb studs, and more specifically, poorly placed thumb studs. The location of a thumb stud is important. This also applies to holes, thumb holes as well, but more studs than holes, and we'll get to why in a second. So primarily, one of the worst things that you can do is put a thumb stud on a knife or a thumb hole that's in a location that doesn't really allow you to use it properly. One of the worst offenders of this was the original quiet carry drift. The thumb hole on that thing was basically impossible to use unless you Spidey flicked it. The geometry just did not work out. Here's another example. This is a Civivi knife, a new one. The Hypershock, I believe is what it's called. And it has this little groove cut out. And that's not really the primary opening method. On here, it's mostly gonna be the flipper. You can Spidey flick it just fine. However, you cannot thumb flick. Can't do it. It drives me crazy. But one thing about the thumb stud placement that you may not consider when you buy the knife that may also just be like stubbing your toe just suddenly later on in ownership when that blade gets a little dull is how it affects the sharpening. This thumb stud, and this is not a horrible example, but there are some examples that are much worse than this, but this thumb stud is positioned well in front of that sharpening choil. So your edge termination is to the rear of the stud, which means that when you're sharpening it, if that thumb stud is too thick, your sharpening stone or whatever you're using might be hitting that thumb stud. If you don't care about marring up the thumb stud, it's not that big of a deal, but it just grinds my gears when I cannot get the very bottom of my edge sharpened because the thumb stud is blocking the stone. This becomes a bigger problem if you're reprofiling an edge. So at 25 degrees, you might be clearing that thumb stud without issue. If you tend to lay back that edge a little bit, you're gonna hit that thumb stud. And if you can't remove those thumb studs, if they're not threaded on, it can be an issue. It'll be a big issue, really. And that is why thumb studs being in a weird place is worse than a thumb hole, because a thumb hole is never going to interfere with sharpening the knife. A perfect example of a company that does this right is Hinderer, and a lot of companies do. It's not just Hinderer, but look at the position of the thumb stud in relation to the edge termination. The heel of the blade, it is to the rear of the choil, which are right actually centered over the choil, which means that it will never interfere with your sharpening. And I wish more knives were like this. It doesn't kill it for me because it's something that only comes up when I'm sharpening a knife, but at the time that I am sharpening, just like stubbing your toe, man. You're like, oh yeah, that thing. And speaking of sharpening, that brings us to item number 2 on this list, no sharpening choil, or no finger choil, just a no choil. Not everybody wants a finger choil, a big, nice finger choil that lets you choke up on the knife and get a good grip. Not everybody wants that. I get it, it's not for every design. But a sharpening choil, Spyderco, I love you, I really do. I love you, Spyderco. But can you just put a sharpening choil on these knives, please? So for those of you who are not familiar with what I'm talking about, a sharpening choil is this right here. This little notch cut just below that plunge line that gives you just enough room to sharpen the very heel of the blade. A finger choil is the same thing, but much larger, and it allows you to choke up on the blade, and it allows that thumb stud to clear. So a big finger choil is nice sometimes, but it's not for everybody. It's not for every knife design. A sharpening choil when a finger choil is a little too much solves that. But let's just look at Spyderco for a second. This is the Spyderco Shaman. It has a finger choil, but that plunge line is in front. It's just on the front edge of the finger choil, and there's no sharpening choil. So that means that this edge terminates into that plunge line, and it can be very difficult to sharpen just the very heel of that blade, and it's annoying. Just give me a little choil. I mean, you can put one on yourself, I get it, I understand that, but just ship the knife with a small choil. That's all it takes. It's not that difficult. All right, so number 3 is gonna be one of the bigger ones for me, and maybe some of you, but terrible pocket clips. I don't know why we're still dealing with this. I know that a lot of you don't have the same issue that I have, which is I bend out pocket clips way too often. This Civivi Sokoke, whatever the name of this knife is, I bent this clip out on here 3 times in about a week. And I mean, yeah, it's probably a little bit of user error, but if the clip were better, it wouldn't happen as easily or as often. So one of the reasons that I bend clips out is because I tend to like brush by tables and cut corners really close. It's just, I've always done it, I always do it. And what ends up happening is the clip catches and bends. Now, that can be for a number of reasons. I don't tend to bend milled clips out all that often. I mean, it has happened, but milled clips are tougher in general, not always, but in general. So they can be bent easily because they're thin, but also they can grab onto things easier because they stick out too far. An example of a thin bent clip that's really not bad at all, I don't love it, but it isn't bad, is this clip on the McNees PM MAC2, the automac. The McNees clip, it's bent, it's very thin. However, the reason it's not bad is because there's nothing much for anything to grab onto. It sticks out very, very little. It's very thin profile. Just look at that compared to how far the Civivi clip sticks out. There's a lot more for things to grab onto when it sticks out this far. So a clip that hugs the knife a lot better is less likely to catch things. But there are other reasons why a clip might suck. One of those being that it's mounted too low on the knife and the knife just sticks way out of your pocket. Absolutely hate that. And it might just come with very low retention, and often you can adjust that, but there are situations where adjusting the clip retention is not easy. For example, another one of my favorite knives, the Invictus from PDW, this clip right here, it's mounted from the inside. You have to take the entire knife apart to adjust this clip. Not ideal. So there are a lot of ways that a clip can suck. It's not just thin wire clip with low retention. It can stick out too far. It can be mounted too low on the knife. There are a lot of things that make a clip really bad. But on the flip side, it's not hard to make a great clip. It's really not at all. Might as well keep this knife in my hand. Number 4 on the list is complicated teardowns, and there are a number of ways that a knife can have a complicated teardown. The most common, I would say, is mismatched hardware. So you have like a pivot screw that's a T8 or a T10, you have body screws that are T6, or if you're Hinderer, you have Phillips for holding your clip on. I think Hinderer is probably one of the worst offenders here. I mean, I still love Hinderer knives, but it's really not fun to take them apart. And I'm not taking my knives apart all the time, but if you have to, sometimes it can be annoying. If you have to have proprietary tools to get a knife apart, that's a complicated teardown. But when it comes to Hinderer, they have a flat head for the pivot. Sounds easy, right? Well, it's free spinning, and on the backside you have a slotted nut that, I mean, it's a Chicago screw really, but it's slotted and you have to have a special tool or make a tool to get that out or get creative. The body screws are typically hex, not Torx. And this one is aftermarket hardware, so there are actually some slotted screw heads on these. And then the clip again is Phillips. So you've got hex, Phillips, flat head with a proprietary back end on that pivot, and everything's free spinning too. So yeah, it's not exactly fun taking apart a Hinderer or a Shirogorov, but another example is something like this. So taking this knife apart, the Invictus from PDW, it's not hard to take apart, but it's complicated. There's like an order of operations to get it apart because of the way that it's constructed. It's just overly complicated construction. You've got to get the scales off, and then underneath the scales, you've got standoffs and stuff underneath that hold this backspacer in, and then the clip is attached from the inside. It's too complicated. Oh, I almost forgot. Free spinning pivots. That's something that can really complicate a teardown of a knife, right? Especially when you have like a show side pivot or a decorative pivot, so you only have Torx on one side and it's not captive. That's the worst. Now, this one is captive, but barely. So there are times where you can take this knife apart and put it back together and it's just slightly off and it'll never center and it'll never tighten down right. But when you have a knife that has a show side to the pivot and it's free spinning, Just a little pro tip for you. When you want to loosen that pivot, open the knife, press either direction, just press that blade laterally so it puts force on the pivot. And then you can sometimes, not always, but sometimes break that pivot loose if it has been Loctited. But yeah, it's never fun to have a free spinning pivot that has a decorative cap on one side. All right, number 5 is more of an annoyance than anything, but it's too many obvious ways to open the knife. And this is really more down to design than anything. And this is not a horrible offender of this. I've seen much, much worse. But what I'm talking about here is a knife that has a groove or a thumb stud, a flipper, a front flipper, maybe a button lock, like just a combination of ways to open the knife. I appreciate there being multiple ways to open the knife, but doing it so obviously with poor design, it just looks dysfunctional and like they threw everything at something, and I don't like that. Now, this one is probably the worst I have personally here, but it's really not that bad. This is the ATCF from Terzoula, the ATCF Lite, and it is a flipper. You can front flip it, and it has a groove on the blade as well. So you can open this thing by Spidey flicking it, you can thumb flick it, you can front flip it, and you can also just use the flipper tab. This one's really not that bad because it's very cohesive, but I have seen knives that have a thumb stud, a flipper tab, a front flipper, and even a groove. Like another example for me that I just can't get on board with is Demko having the groove and the thumb stud. It's just, it doesn't look cohesive to me. I don't necessarily like that. But on the flip side, there are ways to incorporate all of these things where it's really cohesive and nice. And the perfect example of that is the Synapse from Vero. So this knife has a flipper tab that is integrated. It's just in line with the back of the knife. It also has a pocket for Spidey flicking, and it's a front flipper. So this incorporates 3 different opening methods, but it really barely even shows them. I mean, they're all kind of hidden to a degree, and this is good design. When you just throw every opening method at a knife, just because, that's not good design. When it's done so well like this, and it's just so sleek, it almost feels like an Easter egg. When I first handled the Synapse years ago, I even asked Joseph, I was like, did you know you can front flip this thing? And he's like, of course, I designed it to be that way. But it felt like an Easter egg to me because it didn't look like it could be front flipped, but it can. So that is really cool. It incorporates a design. It's meant to be there, but it's so sleek that you don't notice it immediately. That's cool. And what I mean by that is Hinderer. I love the XM-18, but they've got big, chunky flipper tabs and thumb studs, and it's just not for me. I actually prefer this Hinderer XM-18, the non-flipper version, over the ones that have a flipper. All right, now we've made it to the bonus. And this one is more visual and just aesthetic than anything else, and it's not about functionality or anything, and that's billboarding. Too much billboarding. Some companies just put every last little detail they can on the blade, and you don't need that. You don't need it. It's just, you're taking away from the beauty of a knife by putting a bunch of words on the blade that don't need to be there, and if they do need to be there, put them in a place that's almost hidden. You look on the face of this blade, there's nothing. The only thing you got on the back is Vero on the clip, which I could do without, but you have Vero along the spine of the knife, and you have your serial number right there. But here is an example of how not to do it. You've got the Spyderco logo, as well as Spyderco, and the blade steel, which is CPM M4. You have Gayle Bradley's logo, you have Taiwan. I don't understand why companies feel the need to do this. Like Arcform, this is a very clean knife otherwise, but they have the Arcform logo, and then it also says Arcform right beside it, and then M390. I understand stamping the blade with steel or lasering the blade steel on here, but just Arcform right there would have been sick, or just the logo, that would have been fine. But why do you have to have both right beside each other? I just don't get it. Monterey Bay Knives Otter, this knife just speaks for itself. Doesn't have anything on the front at all. On the back, you have just a tiny little logo. And then on the tang of the blade right here, you have the blade steel, which is Magna Cut. Chris Reeve knives, same thing. There's nothing on the blade at all. The design itself is what does all the speaking. And it does have a little CRK logo on the handle, but it doesn't really detract from the design at all. And then Idaho made, but that's it. There's nothing that just jumps out and screams. It's clean. That's how it should be. You don't have to plaster everything all over every inch of the knife. Let the design speak for itself. But I'm just rambling at this point. So let me know, what are some things that just drive you crazy about knives? Some design choices and features of knives that drive you crazy? Let me know in the comments down below. That's it. I'll see you guys in the next video. And until then, carry on.